Maybe there's something primal about the color red. There's a kind of unapologetic exuberance. My name is Yunhee Min, and I am an artist. I'm also a faculty member at UC Riverside Art Department, and we are standing in front of our installation at the Culver Center for the Arts in Riverside.
My name is Peter Tolkin. I'm an architect and partner in TOLO Architecture in Los Angeles, and we're collaborators on the project. We started having conversations about music and the relationship between music, art, and architecture. And one of the things we hit on very early on was the idea that was, I think, first put forward by Goethe about architecture being a form of frozen music. And that was sort of a jumping off point for us in terms of the exploration for this piece.
And spending time in this space, we felt that the neoclassical style of architecture of the atrium felt very static. So we were, thinking about how do we engender a sense of movement in this space that felt very static. So this was a kind of a starting point for us to start thinking about what could we do here.
That's to some degree where some of the composers, like someone like Xenakis, comes into the project in terms of some of the influences. He worked as an architect. He's also, I believe, a mathematician, and he worked with parabolic forms, but he was also very much a kind of composer. So there was kind of interest in that kind of notational diagrams and drawings that he made that were sort of the scores that were used to play the music.
When we were looking at these graphic musical notations, it was very interesting in that it was very diagrammatic, not notations or instructions based on traditional Western way of representing music. And so there was a lot of sort of abstraction from one form of information translating or being translated into something else. And this was an interesting study in thinking about this project.
One of the things that was important to us was to have this thing function at this scale that would sort of somehow, at moments you could understand it as an object that you're moving around, but at other times it would actually start to take on the, in a sense, mirror the architecture or be in relationship to the architecture and register against the architecture and be of a certain scale that you might properly say is architecture or architectural scale.
I think early on we had imagined something that would be sculptural or sculpture-like object, but also at the same time space where you could actually enter into and have a much more of a sort of enveloped experience.
It actually started off as a series of sketches. There was this notion that we wanted this piece, and to some degree the title, this notion of this carpet, we wanted it to be something that in some ways you inhabited. When we first started, we were looking at how would we just make this one gesture that kind of moved through the entire space and kind of brought you in, and then you kind of moved around it and are kind of enveloped in it. Over time, what occurred was this notion of splitting it into almost like three interrelated bands. There's moments when those bands are completely in sync with one another, and there's moments when those bands are in relationship to one another. So the analogy, I guess, was originally kind of musical, and then it kind of took on a life of its own. The next step was like, well, how are we going to make it? And that was a whole other process.
My name is Matt Melnyk. I'm a structural engineer. I was asked by Peter Tolkin, who's one of the co-artists on the project, to take a look at this when it was still at a pretty conceptual stage, and that's really where it started. So I had never worked with paper tube and canvas in this particular application. Probably the biggest challenge that I had was trying to understand how this material would behave and understand how it would behave at scale. Peter had done some smaller tests and some mock-ups and prototypes at a smaller scale, and so the question for me was, great, clearly this has some kind of integrity, but what is it going to do when we scale up to something like what you see behind me? So the testing was a conversation we had very early on, and the testing actually was a lot of fun. We built full-scale prototypes of this assembly, which is the layout of tubes that are glued to the canvas. We needed to take what was the behavior we were seeing in these small prototypes and try to simulate it at a larger scale to verify that yes, in fact, this is the shape that it will take when we install it. In this case, the membrane has a kind of binary behavior. So on the one hand, it does drape and it does want to fall into a catenary. At the same time, when the tubes are glued to the membrane and it's oriented in a certain way, it becomes more rigid, like a beam. You can see in the piece there's some parameters that we're working with. One is the location of the tubes. One is the location of where the piece is supported. In this case, there's some set locations up at the ceiling level where we can hang from. Another is the depth of the tube, and the last would be the spacing of the tube. So you could think of each of those as a little dial, and by having control of all of those, you can find the shape that you're after.
The original idea was we were going to fabricate it in situ in the space and bring together a group of people to make it here. And there was numerous difficulties with that, one of which was that if you actually unroll these pieces, they would roll right outside the door. They're too long. And we decided what we would do was teach a course and get students involved in the production of the piece. I think it's a really critical part of what ended up happening because the students, they were able to help us actually figure out how to, in a sense, take our digital drawings and abstract them, and it ultimately became a series of Excel files that were like gridded Excel files that basically had the location, the color, the size, the distance of each one of these tubes.
The red in this piece came to be as we looked at the palette of this atrium space being mostly neutral and pastel. So we wanted to put color that is unmistakably there and present. So there are 13 colors in the piece. It's really hard to isolate a single color in the piece. When you're looking at a single color, you're also looking at a bunch of other colors around it. So it's always in the context of a field or a bunch of neighboring colors. And as such, it functions more like something might vibrate. So it's sort of a vibration of fields of colors working together.
One of the things I really like about music is the way the music kind of decays and changes in the space and changes your perception of being in a building. I'm often, let's say, in a concert hall, or it could be anywhere, club, or it could be on the street, and I hear something, and it somehow affects my notion of what it is to be in a space. And I'd like to think that this piece has that kind of relationship, and it is somehow, I don't know, musical is not a very specific term, but I'd like to think that it has some of that. And I do feel like there's this, I don't know how to describe it, but it's this like embodied sense of movement that's almost like a kind of tension. And you can feel it sometimes when you look at some of the curves. They're not just a representation of a curve or a structure, they actually are working structurally, so you can actually feel that tension. And to me, that's the same tension I sometimes hear in certain musical pieces that are kind of transforming my sense of the space. So to the degree that it has this musical quality, I feel that there's something sort of successful for us in terms of what we were trying to, accomplish.